Story 1. 15 years ago, I went to a doctor's appointment. They called my name and I went in. They confirmed my birth date as well. They asked when my last period was, and I provided a urine sample which was normal for an annual physical test. The doctor came in to inform me that he was sorry, but I did not appear to be pregnant. I said, "Thank God. Was I supposed to be?" Apparently, there were two patients that day with the same name and the exact same date of birth. She, however, was born on the other side of the United States. The staff said they had never seen that happen in their entire careers. I don't have a particularly common name either. Not uncommon, but I'm not Mary Smith. Story 2. I don't know why, but my parents were sure I was going to be a girl. So much so, they did not pick a boy's name. Surprise, not a girl. 29 years later, I met a lovely college girl with the same first and middle name I was supposed to have. She thought it was a cute pickup line. I don't think she really believed me until she met my mom. Yes, we have been married for 23 years. Story 3. Within about a week and a half, I witnessed a car explode, a house fire, a fatal car accident, and a drive-by shooting. I began to believe I was the problem. Story 4. Took my future wife on a date very early in our relationship. Went through automatic teller machine to get money from her bank. I was driving. When she told me her 4-digit personal identification number, it was the same as mine. For me, it was the alarm code to my house growing up. For her, it was the last 4 digits of her social security number. I saw it as a sign. Mind blown. Story 5. When my father passed away, I was also planning my wedding. We were going to dance to Tiny Dancer. He passed away, and I got in the car to go to my sister's house. It was raining. I remember crying and asking, "Where did he go? And is he okay?" Tiny Dancer came on the radio, and the rain stopped. The sun appeared during the song. I would like to think it was not a coincidence. I lost my best friend that day, and I like the idea that it was him. Story 6. In grade 7, our class was learning about the laws and how the courts work. We went to the courthouse one day to see it up close and in person. As I was sitting there, I realized my dad was sitting on the other side of the room. I instantly started sweating because I had a hunch he was not there to learn about the court system. Sure enough, his name was called out, and he came up for a driving under the influence charge. He ended up losing his license for a year. It was the most embarrassed I have ever been in my life. Story 7. As a teenager, I worked at a coffee shop with many town residents. Because I worked there for years, I became close to the regulars, including an older gentleman and his son who was around my age. The father got me interested in joining the Historical Society, which I did and was a board member of for over a decade. The father eventually needed a lung transplant, which he received. Sadly, he died from lung cancer shortly after the transplant. At this point, I had known the man and his son for over a decade. I went to his funeral, waited in line for over an hour, and when I reached his coffin and his widow, I told her how sorry I was for her loss and how great of a person her husband was. She then asked if I was my first and last name. I said yes. She said, my name from High Street, which is the street I grew up on. I said yes again, very confused. She said, "Sweetie, I was your kindergarten teacher." My jaw dropped. Couldn't believe it. I hadn't seen her since kindergarten and had no idea she was married to the man who had just died. I was neglected as a child, and she took such good care of me. We smiled, laughed, and cried. It was a bittersweet moment I will never forget. Story 8. College class. The professor reads the roll and asks us to raise our hands. 2 of us did, so she used our middle initial. We both did it again, so she asked, "What is your middle name?" We had the same 3 names. Now she is showing up under my background check because it shows I am a pharmacist. I work in healthcare but not in pharmacy. Story 9. Coming out of the grocery store one day to my blue Honda Civic. I had one small bag and pressed unlock on my key fob, opened the driver's side door, and got in. When I tell you something immediately felt off, like the seat felt strange, the mirror was not right. I looked around and saw none of my belongings in the car. I then noticed an older woman staring at me next to her shopping cart. turned my head to the right, and realized what had happened. We had both parked our blue Honda Civics next to each other, both pressed unlock on our respective key fobs, and I had, on autopilot, gotten into the nearest blue Honda Civic. My car was next to hers, and when I got out and apologized profusely, she laughed it off and we went on our way. Story 10. 3 days after my grandfather passed away, I was shopping for picture frames for his wake. I reached up to the highest shelf and accidentally knocked over a picture frame. The glass shattered all over the aisle. I approached 3 employees before finding someone who could help me clean up the broken glass. I even offered to buy a broom so I could sweep it myself. When the employee picked up the frame, I finally realized that there was writing scrawled around it. It said, "My favorite people call me Grandpa." Took my breath away a little bit. Story 11. I have one from less than 24 hours ago. A few days ago, I started a rewatch of a show I loved from the early 2000s. Yesterday, I had finished one season and had the show on in the background while I worked. I was filling orders for my business when I realized, as I was checking the invoice, that the person I was boxing up has the same name as one of the stars of the show I was watching. Right now, it is not exactly a common name, so I decided to check out their Instagram to see if they have any current projects. Just mild curiosity. And yes, they are definitely into the hobby that I sell supplies for. It is a silly coincidence, but I am still excited about it. Story 12. I have 2 stories. 1. I went to university on the other side of my state, in a dorm that had 2 wings joined by an elevator bank. A friend in the other wing asked if her friend coming to visit could stay with me because she had classes. I said, sure. Have her knock on my door. A while later, there was a knock. I opened the door and said, "You know, you look just like my cousin, my second cousin." She replied, "I am your cousin, idiot." 2. I had a roommate for a while in California. Several years later, I was solo touring through Germany with nothing really planned. As I was walking around Berlin, I heard my name called. It was him. Story 13. Oh shoot, I've got just the thing for this. I posted about it previously in other subreddits. I don't know which subreddit to post this in, so any help is appreciated. Preface. I made a post back in 2014 regarding this, not making this up. In 2014, I had my first and only bout of sleep paralysis. I had a box spring on the ground and a mattress, so my bed was rather low. I was lying on my side, and I remember an intense feeling of dread and terror. I was only able to move my eyes, and I opened them to see this dark red figure standing so close to my bed that its knees were touching my bedside. Because it was so close and I was lying on my side, I couldn't make out its face. It began communicating with me, but not through speaking. I just felt this low rumble and the message of, "You are not dreaming. I am very real. I've visited you in the past and will visit you again in 9 years to remind you of my existence. You cannot forget me. Find the red book." It then listed some page numbers, but I don't remember them. I searched around a bit back then and found something about the Demogorgon in one of Dungeons & Dragons monster manuals and figured that was that. Fast forward to November 2023, and I'm listening to some YouTuber talk about dream theory. He mentions Carl Jung's The Red Book. My jaw just about hit the floor and hair stood up on end. How could I have not found this before? So I looked it up, and it's a book detailing Jung's journey through his subconscious. I then realized 9 years had passed, as the entity told me, so I'm a little freaked out but more anxious with excitement. I called my friend who is a librarian in the area and asked if the book was available. He searched his database and the closest book was a few hundred miles away, and you're not allowed to check it out. I then checked Barnes and Noble to see if I could buy it. Lo and behold, there was one copy available in a store a few miles from home. I went there and searched for it for about an hour before asking for help. The staff said I couldn't find it because there was only one copy and it had just arrived that very day and wasn't unboxed yet. The same day I found out about its existence. In summary, I had a sleep demon tell me to find a book and said he'd remind me he was real. I found the book the day one copy was ordered and arrived in the bookstore. The same time he said he'd remind me he was real. Story 14. A very insignificant moment, but once I sneezed at the same time as Dwight on the television show The Office, and Angela said, Bless you. I thanked her before I realized what had happened. Story 15. I was sitting in the smoking lounge at the airport in Manila, Philippines, when a man I knew from serving together in the United States Navy more than 10 years earlier walked in. The last time I had seen him was halfway around the world in California. Story 16. Not my story, but a family friend. His full name is incredibly common, like John Smith, and one day he was driving down the street, speeding a bit, and got pulled over. No big deal, he gave the police officer his information, and the officer went back to his patrol car to check it. Suddenly, the officer burst open his patrol car door, shielded himself behind it while pointing his gun toward the car, and yelled at him to put his hands up. He was terrified and confused and was arrested. The officer eventually told him he was wanted for armed robbery. Long story short, it turned out that the actual robber, another man with the same name, was born in the same city, in the same hospital, on the same day, around the same time, with the same full name. They were both given the same social security number. It took years for him to unravel the mess, but he said it explained a lot of weird, unexplained things, mostly financial, that had happened throughout his life. Story 17. I am an interior designer, and I use SketchUp a lot. I have contributed a handful of models to the 3D Warehouse, a free repository of SketchUp models available for download, but I am not a prolific creator. The 3D Warehouse has millions of models for download. I make things as I need them and add them because why not? I got a job at a local commercial firm, and on my first day at work, I was shown around the office. There was a critique going on for two different projects. Both projects had renderings that contained one of the models I had made. They were different models, and the projects were by two different designers. Story 18. I met Natalie Holloway's mother in Aruba and got an interview with my parents for their small local newspaper in New Jersey. That night at Carlos and Charlie's, a famous Aruba club, Joran Vandersloot tried to pick up one of the girls I was friends with. I told her who he was and that we needed to leave the club. I like to think I saved that girl's life that night. Also in Aruba, I got my picture with Orenthal James Simpson when I was 17, and he invited me to sit with his crew and have a drink. Someone else asked for a picture and turned to his friends, saying, "I'm getting my picture with a famous murderer." OJ snapped, and they started arguing about whether or not he killed his wife. He said every bruise on her body was from him, but he didn't kill her. I finished my drink and left immediately. So I met two famous killers in Aruba. Story 19. About a year into dating, I met my girlfriend's uncle and aunt. They looked vaguely familiar, and after some discussion, it turned out they were former friends of my parents. After some rummaging, the aunt appeared with two pictures. One of my parents and my girlfriend's parents together at a party they were hosting, and one of me and my girlfriend when she was 2 years old, playing together in their yard. We grew up on opposite sides of the country. Story 20. Finding out that my current girlfriend, whom I met when she was 1 year old and now she is 33, was a complete coincidence. When we started talking, we realized that my mother had babysat her when she was 1 year old. Story 21. After college, I moved halfway across the country and shared an apartment with a Florida State graduate, Iris, who had taken circus as her required physical training class. I was away traveling for several months. While I was gone, Iris was hit by a car on the street and thrown some distance. Because she had taken circus, she knew how to fall, so the only physical injury she suffered was breaking one joint of one finger. However, she was in shock and cried for a week, so she was hospitalized. One day in her hospital bed, her phone rang. She answered it, and a male voice said, "Hi Iris, it's Sebastian." She was racking her brain, wondering if she knew a Sebastian. The man on the phone explained that he had just moved to town and Martin had given him her phone number. Iris was thinking, who's Martin? She finally said, "This is Iris, but I'm in the hospital. Who's Martin, and how did he get this number? And who are you?" Sebastian said, "Isn't this Iris Birch from Cleveland?" Iris answered, "No, I'm Iris Miller from Tampa." Then they realized he had dialed the number wrong. Iris was still crying in her hospital bed, so Sebastian suggested that he come over and visit for a while. She got out of the hospital, and after they had known each other for several days, She mentioned my name as her housemate who had been traveling for a couple of months. Sebastian, who had been one of my best friends in college several years before, learned that I had gotten married and changed my name, then divorced and left town. That was why he could never find me. Story 22. My mother died of a rare disease. She had been misdiagnosed with a non-fatal condition earlier, and we were all in denial, clinging to the original diagnosis. About 6 months before her death, I met this woman on a forum for fans of a TV show we both liked. We started talking in the off-topic section, and I mentioned that my mom was sick, but I did not mention the name of her condition. She said her mother died of the same condition. I opened up to her, and she told me a lot about how her mother's condition had progressed. I shared that information with my mom, and I think it helped us both prepare for what was to come. Story 23. I stayed over with a friend one Saturday night after an event that ended rather late. On my way back Sunday morning, I saw a sign for a state park about 90 minutes from where I lived. I decided it was too beautiful a day to go home and sit around the house, so I made that turn and went to the park instead. My first stop was the visitor center. I came out of the bathroom to see my housemate at the front desk talking to the park ranger. We were both stunned. Neither of us had planned in advance to be there, but decided to go on the spur of the moment that day. It would have been a huge coincidence for both of us to go to that park on the same day and find out later. But the timing, where we both happened to be in the visitor center, was mind-boggling. My other housemate was also there, along with their 2 dogs. We all had a great time hanging out together in the park. Story 24. When I was 18, my mom was invited to a family friend's party. It was a 21st birthday, and she was friends with the uncle. She asked me to go with her, but I didn't want to because I didn't really know them that well. She went anyway and had a great time. Most of the people were younger, and they all came in fancy dress. She was chatting to them and laughed, saying there was a big guy dressed as Scooby-Doo. 2 years later, I was dating a guy. We were talking about his friend's birthday party and how he went dressed as Scooby-Doo. It turned out his friend was my family friend's nephew, so my mom had met him 2 years before I did. Maybe if I had gone with her, I would have met my now fiancé earlier. We have 2 kids now and have been together for 8 years. Story 25. I met my now wife by chance. The coincidences started when we realized we both went to the same high school at the same time. We worked at the same place and lived just a few houses apart. Her stepdad turned out to be my niece's great uncle. We discovered all this after a few months of dating. Before I met her, she had broken up with someone who shared my last name. Story 26. I had just moved to Seoul and knew exactly 2 people in the entire country. I ran into one of them in a subway station, nowhere near where either of us lived or in a more central location. I thought that was pretty crazy. Story 27. I went to university in a different city. I had just watched The Truman Show with some friends. I was walking home with one friend, and we were discussing the idea that our lives could be The Truman Show. I was saying how I could prove I existed beforehand when one of my primary school teachers walked up the road and said, "Hello, Lorna. What are you doing here?" I knew he originally came from that city, but I had a hard time convincing my friend it wasn't a setup. That same night, we also found an unopened pack of cigarettes at the end of my road when he couldn't afford to buy any. Story 28. A few years ago, I was getting ready to attend a wedding in an adorable little town. Of course, in typical fashion, I realized at the very last minute that I had completely forgotten to pack any jewelry. So, I was sitting there, dressed up but missing something to tie the whole look together. Total crisis mode. I quickly searched for the nearest boutique, and there was a cute, little family-owned shop just a few blocks away, closing in 10 minutes. Naturally, I grabbed my purse and rushed out. I arrived and practically flew through the door. The elderly woman behind the counter smiled, and I was breathless, asking, "Do you happen to have any necklaces?" She chuckled and said, "You're just in time. I was about to lock up. Let me show you." So, I stood there, flipping through delicate pieces when I noticed her watching me closely. Then she said, "You look so familiar. Have we met?" I was racking my brain, trying to place her face, and then it hit me. Years ago, I sat next to her on a long train ride. We had chatted the entire trip, swapping stories about our lives, but afterward, we went our separate ways and didn't keep in touch. I couldn't believe I just randomly stumbled into her shop, miles from home. I picked a beautiful necklace, and as I left the shop, I couldn't help but laugh to myself. Of all the places, of all the people, it was such a crazy coincidence. Story 29. One time, I was humming a song and went into a grocery store where they were playing the exact same song. Story 30. I have two stories. In 2000, a coworker asked if I could put her on my joke email list. Her email was name initial at domain. I made a mistake and began emailing initial name at domain. A man emailed asking who I was, but he loved the jokes, so I kept emailing. Years later, he invited me to a gallery opening. While chatting, we discovered that we were in the same metropolitan area, from the same hometown a state away. He and my mother had attended the same college and university years apart. His mother and my grandmother worked at the same place. We had relatives in the same town 2 states away with a population of 2,500, and my grandfather and his father were from the same town with a population of 250. When I was a child in the 1970s, I needed glasses and selected the most hideous frames possible. When we went to pick them up, they did not have them. They called the manufacturer. Apparently, another child with my same name and prescription had selected the same hideous glasses around the same time. The manufacturer thought it was a duplicate order and only made one pair. The other child had picked up the glasses earlier that day. Who knows why these things happen? Story 31. This is not the first time I post this on Reddit. More than 25 years ago, my alcoholic father sold his old analog camera to buy some alcohol. Inside the camera bag was a piece of paper with a handmade aperture and shutter speed chart. I had drawn little circles on that paper when I was a child. Fast forward 15 years. There is a pawn shop near where I work, and from time to time I go there to see what hidden gems I can find. One day, there was a camera that looked quite similar to the one my father sold. I bought it on a whim without even checking if it worked properly, just because it looked like the one he sold. Once at home, I took a closer look, cleaned it properly, and searched the bag. Yes, you know where this is going. There was the paper with the chart and my little circles in blue pen. I sat on the sofa for a moment just to let that moment sink in. That camera now holds a place of honor among my other cameras and photography gear. Story 32. Anytime I think back to the circumstances surrounding how my wife and I got together, I get a little baffled. From the outside, we had a classy start to our relationship by hooking up at a party hosted at my house while my parents were away. We were always sort of in each other's periphery during high school but rarely interacted directly until then. Turns out life is weirder than that. The first time we actually met was when I was a sophomore and she wasn't in high school yet, 1.5-year age difference, 2 grades apart. I got a knock on my door after school one day when my parents were both at work. My future mother-in-law was there with my wife in tow. They were looking for my wife's cousin, who hadn't gotten home after school, and they knew she had a boyfriend on my street. I recognized the description pretty quickly because the couple would be right behind me walking home on several occasions. I pointed out the house, my future mother-in-law thanked me, and they left. I felt bad about ratting out the cousin at first, but it turns out she was not a good person, so I feel less guilty now. The second time I met my wife was when she yelled my name from down the hall at school. This was a full year later, so I had no idea who this girl was. It turns out she was yelling at me because her friend had a crush on me and she wanted to get me to talk to that friend. From my perspective, a total stranger was shouting at me from out of nowhere and started running through the crowd of fellow students with a scary, determined look on her face. I still cannot say what came over me, but I turned on my heel and ran the opposite direction. It is kind of funny to look back and think that running away from my wife in what may have been our first real conversation could have led to us getting together in the end. I never did speak with her friend, but in another world maybe that would have tipped the scales in a different direction. I wound up at her house randomly for a bonfire one summer. It was really weird going there later on as we dated because I could swear I recognized it but didn't connect the dots until several months into our relationship. This is probably the most benign coincidence. The party we finally got together at almost didn't happen. I skated through high school but college was challenging. My dog had just recently died. I was basically not in a partying mood to begin with. My friend called me up at midnight on a Friday because his girlfriend had just gotten in from out of town. We were still underage, and my parents were out of town on a camping trip. It was basically the only place they could have a good time. I told him to go away, listing the aforementioned reasons, and hung up. I called him back 3 minutes later and told him I changed my mind because I couldn't sleep and needed a big distraction. He mentioned they'd be bringing a few others, whatever. They brought one other couple and, you guessed it, my future wife. Newly single after a long-term abusive relationship and ready to make impulsive decisions before going off to college. The other two couples encouraged us as we all got more drunk. I could see which way the wind was blowing, but I had never had a one-night stand before. Plus, she was really cute and I had slightly gotten to know her through high school. When we had a moment alone, I drunkenly babbled about how I thought she was really cool and maybe we could hang out more. And she kissed me to shut me up. That was supposed to be that, but I somehow managed to convince her to go on a date the next day. By her own admission, she told her friends at the time that she didn't think it would work out or that she didn't really want it to. She wasn't super interested in dating given her previous relationship. 10 years later, she jokingly still tells me I ruined her plans. I respond that clearly something out there had a different one. Story 33. Not a major event, but this past weekend I went to my friend's wedding at a summer camp that is open for events in the off-season. I told my boyfriend, who was unable to attend with me, where it was. His cousin goes to camp there. We grew up and have family in different cities, nowhere near the location of the camp. Story 34. Possibly not what you were looking for, but maybe someone can explain this to me. My daughter and I went to a big theme park when she was about 6. We stopped at one of the Guess Your Birthday booths, and the man guessed my daughter's birthday on the first try. She was not wearing anything that would reveal her birthday. I had not given her name or birthday for anything at all during the whole trip. He did not ask any questions. We paid and he guessed. How did he do that? Story 35. I work at a financial institution at their headquarters. We changed phone systems recently, which led to a few unusual situations. We were training a new employee who was supposed to practice a few fake calls with trainers. She joined the training queue and a live call came through. Apparently, our live queue was backed up, and they set it to ring other queues with people waiting in the general queue, so specialized staff could help with the backlog. Whoever set it up didn't remove the training queue from the backup triggering. By coincidence, the caller needed exactly what we were training on that day, so they got help, and the new person got the practice we intended. I work a later shift about half the month. I needed a specific person for a task, and she told me to call the XQ, as she was the only person working it that evening. I reached another person who usually backs up that queue when someone is out, small team, and wasn't supposed to be working it at that time. Lastly, I called one of our branches to speak to an employee about an issue. The process is that if we call from headquarters and they don't answer, we get sent to the branch's voicemail. If a customer calls and they don't answer, the call is forwarded to our headquarters general assistants. Q. I was forwarded and got a brand new employee who is sitting right next to me while he learns the ropes. I sent the branch an email, and they responded that they suspected something was wrong because they hadn't received any calls that day but didn't want to look a gift horse in the mouth. They've mostly worked out the bugs now, but it was interesting for a while. My personal extension was changed to a very specific lending department's old extension, so for a while, I was playing secretary and passing along constant messages. Also, I work for a smaller company, and a few times I've answered the general line to help out and connected with the customer I needed to talk to about a ticket calling in over a separate issue. Story 36. My niece went to prom with a friend's son. They go to different schools, and as far as I know, neither they nor their parents knew of the connection. I noticed because pictures from each set of parents showed up one after the other on Facebook. Story 37. The morning after my mom passed away, I went over to my dad's house to hang out with him, my brother, sister-in-law, and nephew, who were living with them at the time. It was late October, and the weather had been gray and dreary as expected, but that morning the sun was shining, and there was a big, bright rainbow in the sky right across from my parents' house. It hadn't rained. There was no explanation for the sunshine or the big rainbow. I knew it had to be her saying goodbye and telling us she was okay now, Story 38. I was in a nature reserve in Florida and started talking to someone who turned out to be from my neighborhood in Philadelphia. A similar thing happened in North Carolina. I struck up a conversation with a stranger and found out her best friend lived a block away from me in New Jersey. My aunt was on a European cruise and started talking to someone who turned out to be her next-door neighbor in Philadelphia over 50 years earlier. My aunt was a teenager and the other woman was a young child when they were neighbors, so they did not recognize each other. Story 39. My parents got divorced when I was young, and eventually my dad got re-engaged. When that happened, he rented out his old house to a man who was in the same situation my dad had been in a few years earlier. A single dad with 2 kids, so the house was perfect, right? Before my dad passed away, the man moved out and my dad sold the house. My dad died that same year. For context, even though they were divorced, my mom became the executor of my dad's estate because he was not remarried, and both my sister and I were minors when he passed. Fast forward 3 years after my dad's death. Now my mom was getting remarried, and she and my stepdad bought a house. My mom recognized the names on the house they were buying, and it turned out they were buying the house where my dad's former tenant had lived with his wife before his divorce. My mom was able to confirm this since she had all my dad's old documents. Story 40. In high school, someone threw a pencil at me from behind my back, and I had absolutely no idea. I was reading something with my hand on the table, and I half-stretched my hand open and closed. As I did, the pencil slipped perfectly into my half-closed hand, standing straight upright. I don't even remember if the person who saw it said anything. I just felt the pencil appear in my hand. I looked at it for a few seconds, then looked around, and no one was near me. I thought, either I'm magic, this pencil is magic, or someone threw this at me, and I caught it with my back turned. I must be a ninja. Story 41. I had a dream once where the diamond came out of my ring. In the dream, the diamond was gigantic. During the dream, I found the diamond and we took it to the jeweler to be reset. The jeweler said the diamond had a flaw. A few days later, in real life, the diamond popped out of my ring when I was getting the baby out of the car seat. I was able to find it, and when I took it to the jeweler to be reset, the jeweler mentioned the diamond was flawed in a place we could not have seen before. Crazy. Story 42. I was in jail and finally got a New York Times crossword puzzle book sent to me. Later, I got a small radio, the ones you see online look much better, and I was listening to it while doing crosswords. I could only listen to National Public Radio from 4:30 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. due to my trustee work status. National Public Radio was talking about Beyoncé's Cowboy Carter. During it, they mentioned that Yo-Yo Ma contributed. His name was said exactly when I had just seen 23 across, Chinese cellist, and was trying to recall his name. What are the odds that I would have a New York Times crossword book, a radio, and National Public Radio was playing a story about Cowboy Carter, and the name would be said as I was pondering it within seconds. Edit. I knew who Yo-Yo Ma was. It wasn't like National Public Radio said, famous Chinese cellist Yo-Yo Ma. I was at the stage of trying to recall a name I knew. Story 43. I still can't figure this one out, but when I was a kid, my family would sometimes go out of state for vacation. What that really was is my mom had to travel for work to a beach area, so in the summer we'd go with her. One year I got a pair of sandals from this beach town that were awesome, the coolest sandals ever. When school started back up, a boy in my class said he saw me there and saw me by the sandals. I didn't believe him, so I asked him to describe the sandals, and he did. They weren't just regular sandals. They had bamboo bottoms with a thick denim strap, and there were seashells sewn to the denim. I didn't wear them to school because flip-flops weren't allowed. I was probably about 10 years old when this happened. I have no idea if he was actually there and saw me by the sandals or if he just happened to guess. Maybe I don't remember describing them to a friend at school. I have no clue. But I remember being so freaked out that he described the sandals perfectly, even though, as far as I knew, he had never seen them. Story 44. There was a particular movie I watched and loved, and being a nerd, I decided to look for fan fiction about it. I found a site devoted to fan fiction and became an avid reader, bookmarking several stories I loved the most. One author in particular had 3 or 4 stories bookmarked by me. A few months later, I had started a new relationship with an amazing woman who had a nerdy side, just like me. We discovered we were both fans of this movie, and she confessed she had written some fan fiction about it. I told her I read a lot of fan fiction about that movie, and we laughed at the coincidence. Well, long story short, the stories I loved most on the site and had bookmarked were written by my new girlfriend long before we met, and I had bookmarked them months before we met. Story 45. My husband and I met at work. One day, long before we were dating, we were just chatting and he mentioned a friend. I knew someone with that name who lived in the same town and asked for more information. I found out it was the same person I knew, a family friend I had known since birth. This means we were likely together many times as kids at their family's parties and events, but we did not remember each other at all. My mom later happened to see him once while they were both at our friend's house. My mom found out we worked at the same place, and he said he knew who I was but did not know me well. She called me and said she met the nicest guy from my work and I should date him. I just laughed. I guess she was right. Story 46. I was reading a book in bed when a naturopath I hadn't seen or talked to in years called me. He said that for some reason, he had an overwhelming urge to call. He started talking about things that sounded strangely familiar. I asked him if he had ever heard of Dr. Joe Dispenza. He said, "I'm reading him right now." I asked what book. He said, "Becoming Supernatural." We were reading the same book. I probably should finish it. It has been in the same location for 3 years, but for some reason, I don't want to touch it. Story 47. I was at a bar in Southern California. There was a Mexican-American man, maybe in his mid-30s, sitting next to a man who looked like Santa Claus. Both were drinking, and Santa said he was from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada. The Mexican-American man said he was also born in Saskatoon. Long story short, they were born in the same hospital 25 years apart, in a city 1,700 miles from where they were shoulder to shoulder drinking. Story 48. On a whim, my wife and I went to a museum many hundreds of miles away from where we live. As we came out, she squinted into the distance at a silver car. "That's my parents," she said incredulously. "They just happened to be there randomly, as there was no particular reason to go to that museum on that day. Pure coincidence." Story 49. A few weeks ago, I forgot my bus pass in my purse after a trip downtown. As the bus pulled up, I panicked, but another lady getting on the bus gave me $5 and offered me another $5 to get home. The next week, my partner's bus pass and work pass fell off his lanyard on his way to the bus stop. He searched all day with no luck. When he logged into his work computer, someone had found them. They offered to meet him at my bus stop, and I had a sudden feeling, and I was right. The same lady had saved both of us 2 weeks in a row. She laughed at the coincidence and told us she was going on vacation next week. So to be careful. Story 50. I was browsing Reddit one night and, in a completely unrelated thread, someone linked a Wikipedia article that piqued my interest. After reading the article a bit, I had to stop and text my dad at about 1 a.m. Surprisingly, he was awake and asked why I sent him a random Wikipedia article. After he actually opened it and started reading, he went down to where he kept a lot of stuff that my grandma had worked on before she passed away and confirmed my suspicions. The random Wikipedia article that was linked was actually about my family from before we came to America. The name caught my attention, and I thought, what are the odds it is somehow my family? We were able to confirm a number of other relations from the work my grandmother had done. It didn't amount to anything, but it was neat to randomly find in a thread on Reddit at 1 a.m. Story 51. One story that comes to mind centers around my late mother. On the day of her cremation, everyone wore a bright color or a color of the rainbow, along with a ribbon matching the color they chose to wear. This was what my mother wanted, as she loved to paint and enjoyed bright colors. It had been raining that morning, but by the time we arrived at the crematorium, the rain had stopped and there was a large rainbow in the sky. I like to think that was my mother watching over everyone and trying to cheer us up. Story 52. I traveled to Istanbul and stayed at an Airbnb apartment. I loved the decor and all the books. Felt like home. Turned out the host has the same birthday as mine, though in a different year. His ex-girlfriend was studying the same subject as my then-boyfriend, and they knew each other. We have kept in touch since then. Story 53. There's a person with the same first name, last name, and middle initial as me, born 3 years earlier on the same month and day, whose social security number differs from mine by 1 digit. Story 54. I have been nearly held at gunpoint entering the country a few times. Someone violent is wanted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation with my name and date of birth. The only thing that has kept this from getting worse is my lack of visible tattoos, especially above the neckline. So much for my midlife crisis plans. Story 55. I lived in Alaska with my husband, who is from a small village there, for 8 years. We moved back to Nevada 4 years ago, where I am from. Recently, I was talking to my brother about his new job at the Department of Transportation. My brother said he likes his boss, who is an avid hunter. After hearing about me living in Alaska for years, his boss said, "One time, I met a guy at an airport who invited me to Alaska to hunt for a moose. He took me to a cabin in the middle of nowhere. He and his brother flew in their planes, and their dad runs a guide business. They commercial fish in the summers. My husband grew up in the same village and was best friends with the man his boss met at the airport. He commercial fished on his boat for 13 years. Their family became my husband's second family. My brother has visited their house when he visited us in Alaska. My brother's boss has been good friends with them since that hunt and sees them yearly, as do we." Story 56. My grandparents lived in a small town in northern Minnesota. One of my brothers moved to Phoenix and was talking to the man next door who was also from Minnesota. He said he grew up in the same town where my grandparents lived and asked my brother which street they lived on. Turns out that when this man was 16, he drove his car through my grandparents' living room. He and my brother ended up living next door to each other in Phoenix. Story 57. I drive a somewhat rare 1990s car in a rare color, a ruby red 1997 Volvo 960 sedan for anyone interested. It is quite uncommon to see another car of the same model. One time, 2 or 3 years ago, I was driving down a rural highway and approaching a three-way intersection. At the exact same time, 2 other cars of the same make, model, and color approached the intersection from each direction. It was surreal, to say the least. Story 58. I was recently headed to the casino near where I live with my fiancée to go to a store there and grab a quick bite to eat. Just a quick in-and-out trip. On the way in, we saw billboards that Jon Stewart was doing a show there that night. I have been on a Jon Stewart kick lately and thought to myself, damn, that would be super cool to see on a whim, but tickets are probably way too expensive and I'm sure it's sold out. I just let it float to the back of my mind. 5 minutes later, we were getting out of our car in the parking garage at the same time as the people in the car in the space right next to us. Suddenly, I hear my fiancé's name. It turns out they were co-workers of hers from a job she worked at nearly 3 years ago. We were friendly with them but hadn't seen them since then. After saying our hellos, she says, "Hey, do you guys want to see Jon Stewart tonight? I've got 2 extra tickets I don't need." Not the wildest situation, but in the moment, I was floored by the serendipity of the entire thing. Needless to say, we saw an impromptu comedy show that night. Story 59. I randomly think about someone I have not seen for ages, and they appear. This happens way too often. Last time, it was an old schoolmate who had moved away. He popped into my head, and literally a few minutes later, I bumped into him walking down the street. Story 60. I met my now wife at a bar about 5 years ago. She was supposed to meet for a blind date with a man who had the same first name as mine and a last name that sounded very similar. He never arrived, and when she asked around trying to find him, the similarity in names started our conversation. I often wonder what would have happened if he had shown up. Story 61. Good one. About 3 years ago, I worked at a popular upscale restaurant in my city. I was working as a busser and often made the rounds around the restaurant. At one point, I walked past the bar and saw a guy I swore was my friend Can, whom I hadn't seen in about 6 years. As I walked closer, I realized it definitely wasn't him and kept working. About an hour later, my friend Can was standing at the bar. It blew my mind. To clarify for anyone who may think I actually saw him earlier but just didn't see him clearly, He was wearing different clothes and everything was different. It definitely wasn't him at first. Story 62. I was talking to my grandmother on the phone, making plans for the next time I would visit her house. She promised she would make me spaghetti and meatballs when I came over. About a week later, she unexpectedly passed away in the middle of the night. She had actually made spaghetti and meatballs for dinner the night before, so she fulfilled her promise. Story 63. I grew up in a rough neighborhood. My brother passed away from gun violence. He was going to community college and turning his life around after being in and out of juvenile hall. At his funeral, his college counselor came and he approached me. He gave me his business card and told me to call if I wanted to continue. I didn't think much of it and threw away the card. I also ended up living a life of trouble, going in and out of jail. When I got out, I decided to turn my life around and go back to community college. I started to have good days but was unable to get the resources to continue. I was at the point of dropping out and went to my counselor to see what resources were available, but he was sick, so they asked me to have my appointment with the director. I walked in and did not recognize him. I made a comment about how many brochures were on the shelf and jokingly said, "You're an old man." He said, "Yeah, I've been here for a while." I said, "Oh, my brother went to community college here. You might have known him." He asked what his name was, and then he broke down in tears. It was 10 years to the day of my brother's funeral. We had a long conversation, and he was able to offer me a job at the office. For that reason, I was able to have a job on campus and focus on my studies. I graduated, went to school, and now I am an attorney. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.